Thank you and welcome to the fourth installment of the Maynard Sudman Littleton Coin Company lecture series. This time we're going back to paper notes with Wendell Wolka, and his name is very familiar with any of you who are involved with collecting paper money, and he is going to talk about antebellum banking. Wendell?
Yes, not to be confused with Aunt Mabel's banking, but now, since this is right after lunch, you're not going to just be able to sit back there and doze. This is an audience participation presentation, so I would encourage you to move up where you can get a good close look at the screen. Because what we're going to do is we're going to look at banking as it was conducted prior to national banks, when you had thousands of different banks and issuers and tens of thousands of different designs. And each and every one of you is going to be a merchant, and each and every one of you is going to decide whether you take certain notes or not. If you're wrong, you owe me the amount face value of the note, and I'll take checks and cash after the presentation. But hopefully this will give you a significantly enhanced perception of what it was like to actually conduct business back in the days prior to the advent of national banks and, in fact, federal currency. So we've titled this the dark side of 19th century banking, the nefarious purveyors of the queer. Now, this title was not picked because we're in San Francisco. The queer is the very common street moniker for paper money that just wasn't quite right. That was counterfeit or somehow otherwise not exactly what it was supposed to be. So the subtitle is The Wild and Woolly World of Paper Money in Antebellum America. And just because the note happened to be very attractive and looked like it was well printed was absolutely no guarantee that the thing was any good. To give you an idea of how much it cost to get into the banking business in the 1840s and 50s, notes cost about 1 cent and a quarter a piece to print. And it cost you probably $400 to have a steel plate, engraving plate made to print notes from. So if you could scrape together $400 or $500, eureka, you were in business. And as you can appreciate, if you could print $5 and $10 and $20 bills for 1 cent and a quarter a piece, the leverage factor was significant. So this happened to be one of Indiana's finest exports. The Citizens Bank of Gosport literally closed in the middle of the night. They chased them down the Wabash and Erie Canal and never did catch up with them. So this is a case of just because it looks good doesn't mean it is. So why was it so wild and woolly? Well, first of all, before 1863, there was no federal regulation of banking and paper money. It was a purely laissez-faire, left to the states device. And some of the states were not particularly adept at this either. And so it was kind of like open invitation to come on in and do your own thing and just have it your way, because we aren't going to try to stop you, or we don't have the wherewithal or the resources to stop you. The other issue was that there were thousands of different issuers of various quality and legality, and there were many thousands of different designs that fell into the same situation. And in fact, there are probably 10,000 different designs of banknotes that were in circulation prior to the Civil War. The other thing was, of course, that knowledge usually being power, there wasn't much knowledge back then. Information was almost always late. You know, they were telling you what went wrong 3 months ago. Well, that doesn't cut it when you're up against people who are just simply working on the fact they can make things happen faster than you can report them. So financial and economic news was almost always too late. They were on the scene after the problem had occurred. And then there was even the issue, even if the bank was genuine, that reality sometimes didn't square with theory when it came to the security that was allegedly behind some of these banks' issues. Most every bank would swear up and down that their notes were redeemable in specie or in gold or silver coin. In point of fact, there was probably a significant proportion of the banking population that didn't exactly adhere to that most of the time. So the results were pretty much predictable. First of all, banking was a very local affair. If you had paper money that was more than 5 or 10 miles from home, you had an issue. If you're tired of paying ATM fees, you would have loved this setup, because every time you took your notes another 20 miles down the road, you got to turn it in for the local money, and you got nicked for 1.5% or 2% every time you did this. And so if you were a merchant traveling from the East Coast to the wild and woolly hinterlands in Ohio or Indiana, you could lose 7 or 8% before you ever got started. So paper money was a local issue, and you hear tales of people who would rather take a counterfeit on a local bank that at least they knew the bank than they would a genuine note on a bank they didn't know anything about. So you had some really weird behavioral reactions to this mishmash. The old nefarious purveyors were able to counterfeit and produce totally fanciful banknote designs because really no one knew what these notes looked like anyway. You just kind of went with gut instinct, and you employed what I call the club mentality. You all remember the club that you used to put on your steering wheel so that the thief would steal the guy's card next to yours because it was easier? Well, this was the same idea. Instead of a cash register that held 5s, 10s, and 20s back then, you had a cash register that held notes that we knew were good, held notes that we thought might be good, and held notes that perhaps we should pass on to one of our worthy customers before the end of the day. And literally, the drawers were divided up in those kinds of categories. It's estimated that perhaps a third, and I suspect it was more, of the money paper money in circulation prior to the Civil War, something was wrong with it. The bank was bad, the notes were bad, whatever. And so the uninformed and the careless, the so-called weak and old in the herd, often got singled out for special attention by the folks who were out to make a profit the new-fashioned way, and so they did. So accepting a foreign note was really quite an involved process, and a foreign note, again, we defined as anything that was from more than 10 miles away. First of all, you had to decide, was the bank any good today? Then you had to decide, all right, I think the bank's good, but now as to the note itself, was the note any good? Or was it counterfeit, altered, raised, spurious? And even then, if you determined, I think I've got a good note and I think it's on a good bank, you had the extra little bonus issues of, where was it payable? When was it payable? And what was it payable in? And so this was not just give your $5 to the clerk, get your change, and get out to the parking lot. This was an involved process that, if you were really careful, took some time. As you can appreciate, even back in the 1840s and 50s, if you had 5 people in your general store and they were all getting a little antsy in line, you tended to take shortcuts. And that's what the nefarious purveyors were banking on, that you in fact would say, just take it and we'll sort it out later. Because if the note was payable in current banknotes or currency, you got to start the whole loop all over again. In other words, some people would just simply pay you different kinds of bills for their bills. And then you got to start all over again. So let's see how the process worked. Now, we're going to take our first vote, and you have to vote. If you don't vote, we're going to be here all afternoon, and Q. David Bowers will be irritated. So just take a shot at it and see what you think. If you were a merchant in 1857, would you accept this note? I'm going to give you about 3 seconds to look at it, and I want you to raise your hand whether you'd accept it or not. There's the face of the note. There's the back of the note. How many people would take this note? How many people would not take this note? Suspicious people. Well, you folks who wouldn't take this note were out of luck because this is a genuine note. Now, some of you have heard talks like this before, and you looked at that portrait on the left and you go, good God, is that an axe murderer or what is that? And the answer is this is a completely genuine note that simply went to the low bidder. These notes are just terrible examples of work that simply just wasn't very good. And this was part of the problem. Sometimes the counterfeiters did better work than the real companies did. And so in this case, if you turned the note down, you just lost the sale because this is a genuine note. So that sounds, gee, Wendell, that sounds real interesting, but how do you go about determining that, or how would they have gone about determining it? Well, if you lived in Madison, Indiana, which is where this note was from, you could walk right down the street and see if the bank opened that morning. And lo and behold, that was probably the easiest way to do it. But you had other alternatives. You could work off of word of mouth and rumor. Usually the local newspapers were in the business of spreading that kind of stuff. You could depend on trust and hope. Don't even try to figure out what it is, but pass it on quickly, or you could depend on the local newspaper. Now, if you think the press today is politically aligned, the press back then was even worse. If you had a paper in town who was an anti-bank paper, they would, of course, put the worst construction on everything, and vice versa. Or you sometimes could use what I call CNBC of the 19th century, if you were a merchant, the counterfeit detector. And what a counterfeit detector was a publication that you got every 2 weeks or every month, and this is literally a newspaper format, and it listed every single last bad bank and bad note in the United States, believe it or not. But there were some flaws with that. As I said, it was biweekly or monthly, and it usually they did both ways. They either listed all the good ones or all the bad ones. Sometimes it was easier just to list the good ones. But it was usually a reactive publication. They told you what they found out about 2 weeks ago. And it wasn't always immune to graft. There were documented cases where the counterfeiters would pay an honorarium to the publisher of the counterfeit detectors to not necessarily bring the bad news about their bank to everyone's attention, at least for a little bit. And so you sometimes had the folks who published this in the pay of the folks they were trying to protect you against. And they had very limited or brief descriptions at best. You'd see a description for a counterfeit that said it's dark and coarse. What does dark and coarse mean? I mean, you're really left to kind of your own devices, but it was all they had. So again, if we look at our situation, we can look up under Indiana, we can look down here for the Bank of the State of Indiana. The good news is it's only selling at a 1% discount, so that's good. And you see that there is a branch at Madison, Indiana. So we're feeling pretty good about the bank. And in fact, that bank was a legitimate one. Very limited descriptions. You can see here they don't even describe the notes at all. And it didn't usually answer the question, well, what about a note that isn't listed? So there were some other approaches where they actually made a woodcut of the bank note in question, and then they would have all these diagnostics. This is the Bill Feva Cherry Picker's Guide to Obsolete Paper Money circa 1840. And they would list all the little nuances of genuine versus counterfeit notes. In this case, they've zeroed in on the word "of" between Bank and Indiana, and they've said that on the genuine notes, it's shaded, and on the counterfeit notes, it isn't. So you can imagine looking this stuff up while you've got somebody here trying to get done with their purchase. Didn't work very well. And the fallacy, of course, to this whole thing was, guess what? The counterfeiters can read too. So they go, oops, they've caught us on this. We'll have to fix that, which they often did. Okay, vote number 2. Is everybody ready? A counterfeit is a note that's designed to, as closely as the counterfeiter can make it humanly possible, resemble a legitimate note on a legitimate bank. And the mark, the target of this little episode, is someone who knows about the bank and has some idea of what the notes are supposed to look like, but just like you and I, maybe doesn't have a lot of time to do a detailed study of it down to the little gnat's eyelash type details. Okay, how many people think this note's a counterfeit? I have 1, I have 2, I have 3, I have 4, I have 5. How many people think this doesn't look half bad, would probably take it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, all right, we're evenly divided. Some clues. Counterfeiters could never do eyes. Counterfeiters use Frosty the Snowman as their model for eyes on portraits, just black lumps and just little things like that little white sparkle in each eye they couldn't or didn't reproduce very well. The backgrounds on the portraits. On the counterfeits, they're usually just a dark, muddy kind of mush. On the genuine notes, it's a very fine cross-hatching. Believe it or not, the uniformity of lettering and the engraver's imprint. The engravers usually printed their names someplace on the note in very small letters, and it's a kind of a dead giveaway that you don't think that the printing company would have their name kind of roller coaster up and down across the bottom of the note, or put the letter E backwards. Some of them did, though. So the uniformity of lettering and engraver's imprint, the uniformity of lathe work because they use mechanical lathes to develop later designs and so forth. So let's take a closer look at that note. We'll give you a second chance to vote if you care to, or you can stick with your original decision. Now, here's a portrait. And you see it's a pretty decent background to it. The portrait's pretty good. Here's the engraver's imprint. That doesn't look half bad. Then here's a detail on the other side. Now, how many people now are even more convinced that it's real or more convinced that it's a counterfeit? How many people think it's real? Okay, we have garnered some people over to the side of believing that it's real. How many people still think it's counterfeit? Because why would... And the counterfeit that we just looked at is one of the best counterfeits in antebellum America. Whoever did this did a wonderful job on it. But there are some little details that are different. We're going to look at the 3 same areas. Here is the portrait, and the eyes are just a little bit better. And the background is just a little more clearly defined from the portrait. And the diagnostic, the Bill Feva way to find out whether you've got a genuine note or a counterfeit note is that the leg on the P comes down into this notch. On the counterfeit one, they laid out the spacing on the lettering got away from them, and it bumps into the top instead of down in the notch. This looks good, this looks good. And sometimes the counterfeiters were too good for their own good. If you remember on the other one we looked at, both L's were exactly the same height, and they stood there right in front of God and everybody, nicely lined up, and if you were a counterfeiter, you'd assume they'd do it that way. Well, on the genuine note, the L kind of gets lowered and bumps in behind the shield. So if you were really going to do a job as a merchant, you had to be looking for these little nitty-gritty details, and you could take all day to do it. So the easiest answer was just don't accept 20s. And sometimes that's what they did. Okay, we're going to give you another chance. How many people think this one's a real thing? We got 1, we got 2. How many people think it's a fake? Oh my, how are you two feeling about this? Now, why do you think it's a fake? John?
Portraits are muddy.
Okay, the portraits are muddy. Anything else? Well, suffice it to say, we want to make sure we don't cut Q David too short here. So this is a wretched, wretched counterfeit. Horrific. Way to go, Eric. Our friend here looks like an axe murderer with about a 3 days growth of beard. This guy looks like a frog that got run over by a car. And you can see the background. See how blotchy it is? You got white spots and dark spots, and this is just a wretched counterfeit. This is the genuine note. Different branch, but same design. And you can see the difference is night and day in the portraits. We've even changed races on the two maidens up here, and so this was a wretched counterfeit. Then you get into the question, well, could the note be altered? And the definition of an altered note is that folks who used to do these crooked things used to buy up notes from banks that went under. And they would buy them for essentially the value of paper waste. So they might pay $10 for 1,000 sheets of notes that had never gotten issued. And it's the old parts as parts routine. They could use the notes as is, they could use the notes for parts, or they could use the notes and change them. So an altered note was originally issued by a bank that had gone defunct for some reason, but was physically a change so it looks like it's an issue from another bank. How did they do that? Well, they did that by erasing things and printing in new names. They did it by cutting and pasting things. All sorts of different ways, but it was mechanically changed from a note that was worthless to suggest that it might be some new type of a design issued by a bank that was still in business. And the target was someone who knew about the bank, but didn't know schmatz about whether the design was correct or not. Okay, is everybody feeling good about themselves? All right, we'll have a show of hands. How many people think that's a good note? It's on the Greenfield Bank, Greenfield, Massachusetts. How many people feel comfortable about that? Okay, we got Eric the Foolish over here is voting he likes it. All right, we got four other people think it's okay. How many people don't like it? Okay, how many people don't even know? Okay, all right, we're split third to third. Why don't you like it?
Looks like the red background's kind of missing from kind of that Greenfield Bank. They went some erased.
Okay.
Took some of the red away.
Somebody might have erased that and put in something else. All right.
That state name looks as if it's been laid over in such a way that it wasn't in the original design. It's a long word. And perhaps
Okay. All right. All right. Anyone feeling that they said was genuine, a little queasy now? No? Well, maybe this will make you feel queasy. How about this one? From the Brighton Market Bank of also of Massachusetts. How many people think, aha, this is a genuine note that the other one was changed to? How many people think this is a fake? Okay, lots of fakes. One trusting soul. I would like to talk to you afterwards about certain investment opportunities. Well, just to disturb everybody. How about this one? Bank of Amsterdam, New York. How many people think, okay, all right, he finally showed us this is the original note? Oh, now you're not voting. How many people think it's fake? All right. The answer is they're all fakes. This is the Pioneer Association of Lafayette, Indiana, another one of Indiana's leading exports in the 1850s. Notes from the Pioneer Association have been altered over 150 different banks that we're aware of in the United States. And somewhat, I think you were very perceptive. This red tint, if you look around the letters of Pioneer Association, you see that red tint is all the way behind there. When you go back to the other notes, you see that all of a sudden there's this clear space, and that's because they've erased this. And they make themselves a little printing plate, and they just put in the name of a bank. When somebody gets wise to the Bank of Amsterdam, they change it to the New Brighton Market Bank. And when somebody gets wise to that, they change it to the next bank. All the while, they have a stack of these, and they just keep using these. So these are altered notes. Then there's the question if the note was raised. Now in this case, the purveyor of the queer has an investment because the note is a genuine note originally, but it's of a low denomination. So classically, someone would take a 1, do a little modification here and there, and turn it into a 10. So he makes $9 on the deal. But he always starts out with a genuine note on a genuine bank and changes it to a different denomination from the same bank. And here, the target of the deception is someone who knows the bank but doesn't have a clue whether this is some new design or just doesn't know. Okay, get ready. Is this note raised or not? It's a 10 on the State Bank of Ohio. The State Bank of Ohio had 41 branches, issued $25 million in currency during its 20-year life. How many people think this is a genuine 10? Okay, how many people think it's probably a fake? All right. All right. How many people are in the dark? Okay, the other third, good. All right. What bothers you about it if you don't like it? You are a little slightly concerned that for some reason this seems to be going downhill?
Yeah.
Yes? Anyone want to change their vote who is the trusting part of this? Okay. Well, then again, it might be this one. How many people think this is a genuine 10? How many people think it's a fake? How many people are really confused now? All right. Well, the answer is they're both fakes. We have the poor man's raised note and we have the educated man's raised note. This is a 1. This is the ever-popular Gustavus Swan, who was the first president of the bank. And as some of you pointed out, what they did is, remember I said sometimes they erased, like the bank title, put a different title in. Other times they'd buy a stack of notes and they would just use the parts. And what happened on that first note is that they literally cut out a 10 out of an old note that they paid maybe a penny for or a quarter of a cent for, and they literally pasted it on top of the 1. On that particular note, you can actually peel up the 10 and look at the 1. And they changed this. Fortunately, the word 10 and the word 1 both have the same number of letters, so that was easy to change. They erased this. They changed this. They put a 10 over the 1 here and put a little 10 down here. Sometimes if it was too much trouble, they just tore that part of the note off. Didn't have to do anything with it then. So this is the original source note, but there's still a nagging question. Why would somebody go to all the trouble of putting a whole new right end on the note? This involved taking this and doing a whole plate with a portrait and a counter, erasing the last inch of the note. Why would somebody do that? Here's the reason. Remember we said the counterfeit detectors had these very, very minimalist descriptions. Here's the genuine 10. And the genuine 10 in most of the counterfeit detectors said 2 male portraits. Didn't say who they were, just said 2 male portraits. So in order to more closely match the counterfeit detector description, they put a whole new right end on the note. Here's a very rare 20. They often times went after the large denominations because if you're going to put a lot of work into a note, you might as well make it worth your while. So this is a very rare 20, except it's actually a very rare 2. This is from a different branch, but again, what they did, real simple, they took this out, they took this out, they put a large 2 and a 0 and erased that, and they redid the back. So they went from a 2 to a 20. Then we had the issue of spurious notes. A spurious note is a completely fictitious design, sometimes on a completely fictitious bank. This is where the counterfeiters and the other folks just simply decided to make up a note. Why not? With several thousand different banks and not much information, you could do that. And the target was someone, usually not local. You never put these notes in circulation where you said they were from because the locals knew better. So you put this in circulation in the state next door. And you told whoever was going to put these in circulation for you, I don't care what you buy anything. Buy cows, buy corn, buy wheat, whatever you can get for it. And the target was someone who didn't have a clue as to what banks were legitimate or anything else. So typically somebody out in the back 40 acres who just didn't have much contact. So we'll get a chance to vote here. How many people think this is the Bank of Commerce in Cleveland, if you'd take it? See, now you're gun shy to take anything, aren't you? How many people think it's bad? Why? That's okay. That's not the right answer, but something a whole lot more easier than that. Look on the right, on the left rather. You see on the left, this was originally done for the Mining and Manufacturing Company of Rockport, Indiana. They got lazy and decided, why would we have to erase that? So this is the bank is a legitimate bank in Cleveland, but this is a completely fictitious note. Bank of Cleveland or Bank of Commerce never issued anything that looked remotely like this. Then we get into all sorts of interesting, complicated things. They made a counterfeit plate for the State Bank of Ohio. You may remember that one with 2 portraits. And this, usually, this is, Frankenstein's monster here. And we got people looking really weirdly at each other here. It's a pretty bad counterfeit, but the heat was on. They got discovered, so they go, not to worry. We'll just change it from the State Bank of Ohio to the National Bank of Equality, Illinois. Who would know? You notice they started to run out of room here. State ran into the vignette, and Illinois kind of gets buried here. But they just changed it to a different bank because the heat was on. So let's say you get through all that. You finally got a good note on a good bank. You've convinced yourself that it's okay. Then you have the little issue of, well, where might that be payable? Now, if you look at this, you assume this is from the Exchange Bank of A.J. Parent and Company, Marshall, Michigan. You have not read the fine print, ladies and gentlemen. It's at the Exchange Bank of A.J. Parent and Company in Marshall, Michigan, the Michigan City and South Bend Plank Road Company, who just happens to be 80 miles away, will pay you the money. So we'll gladly pay you, but only if you take it 80 miles from here. So the usual reaction is, we'll just pass it on. It's not worth the pain and suffering to pay somebody to go to Marshall, Michigan to redeem this stupid $2 note. So you had to be careful where it was payable. Then you had the issue of when it was payable. And these, I call these the wimpy notes. I'll gladly pay you next Thursday for a hamburger today. Well, this was the 19th century equivalent. This is a note that was payable 190 days after date. And so if they issued it today, about 6 months from now, we'll think about paying you. And in the meantime, best of luck, God. I think you can get anybody else to take this. Although the closer you got to that time frame, the more likely it was someone would take it. So these are called post notes. It's like a post-dated check. Then there was a little issue of what it was payable in. And this is payable in current bank bills. And this means, congratulations, now you start the whole process all over again, because now he's going to give you some other trash, and you have to figure out if that's any good. So there you have it. It was, accepting paper money was obviously not the straightforward process that most of us have it today, because we don't have a monolithic design from a Federal Reserve Bank that most of us at least, trust. And it was a very complicated way to do business. There were any number of different ways that the unwary could be deceived, and there were always people looking for more if they could find them. And the other bad thing was that there wasn't much of a safety net in terms of information other than judgment and a practiced eye to help in making an assessment. So this was in fact just a miserable way to try and conduct a national economy. It's a miracle it went as long as it did. So that's the story. Any questions? Sir?
Am I correct in assuming that the counterfeit as well as the genuine notes are collectible today?
Absolutely. Paper money collectors, we have some oddities to our approach to things. We pride ourselves in having more grades that begin at poor and work our way down than coin collectors have for uncirculated. We have fair, poor, wretched, very wretched, extremely wretched, gem wretched, unidentifiable, and we collect the contemporary counterfeits just as joyfully as the genuine notes, right alongside. Any other questions? Sir?
Sorry, I came in at the very end. I'm into Confederate money, and I've noticed in the past year it's almost going to make you develop vertigo. Some of the prices have gone up in some of the higher grades. I've dropped down to like BF, which I never thought I'd live to do. Do you have any guess as to how long this bubble will go before it
Well, we went through this once before, about 1980, and when it came down hard. It's hard to say because a lot of people are migrating over to paper money from things like from the round side of the business. For example, a friend of mine by the name of Roger Durant, who some of you know, has collected obsolete notes for years, and at the summer seminar a couple years ago, he had a slide presentation of 275 different obsolete notes that are rarer than the 1913 nickel, which kind of got people a little stunned. So in terms of what you pay versus the absolute rarity involved, obsolete notes are still a raging bargain, as are many Confederate notes for that matter. The issue is one of really supply. You won't find an obsoletes collector arguing with a dealer over whether the note is good or fair. It doesn't happen. And the reason it doesn't happen is, as my good friend Don Fisher used to say, bad breath is better than no breath at all, which means that on notes that are absolute rarities that there may be 2 or 3 known, or only 1 known, you would be foolish to pass on the note because you didn't like the fact that it had a corner fold. So you take what you can get, knowing that you'll have a ready market for the one that you have if you ever find a better one. And typically that doesn't happen very often. So the problem is that there's a finite supply of this stuff. And most of the dealers who deal in currency, their biggest trouble is finding enough material to satisfy customer want lists and so forth. It's not quite as true in things like large size US type notes and the Black Eagle silver certificates and so forth. Well, guess what they're grading these days? Black Eagle silver certificates.
The whole thing is drying up totally.
Yep.
There's a dealer back east. He said he would try to find me a Griswold T31. And I said, for the same money, if you find the Holy Grail, I'll take that first too.
Yeah. So.
He said he probably asked for less for the Grail.
Yeah. We haven't yet gotten to the point where it's a tulip craze, where we're passing notes back and forth between each other, hoping that somebody might buy them eventually. So, who's to know? Sir.
What currency was used in international foreign trade?
Usually it was bills of exchange that were payable in specie. So you would literally see letters where they would go out and they would buy specie at like a 2 or a 3% premium, and you'd send back and forth bills of exchange, which were nothing more than a check that was payable in specie.
Now, who would guarantee that?
The full faith and credit of the guy who put it out.
Okay. So it's not too terribly different than this system, but I guess there was more reputable people involved at that level?
Well, the Eastern Money Center banks, the banks in New York and Philadelphia, you had some major, just like today, you had some major banks there that had more credibility than some of their country folk brethren from the Midwest and so forth.
Okay, so private money altogether you wouldn't say was a problem? Maybe it's...
No. There were some banks that were extremely honest. As I mentioned, the State Bank of Ohio issued $25 million, and not a soul ever lost a cent. Not a cent.
I guess it would be hard to say, but over time, especially with conditions like we have now where information travels at a much faster pace, would you say
that would have stopped some of this?
Mm-hmm.
But there, I mean, you were dealing with information that was a month old, and these guys were faster on their feet than a month.
Sure.
Their whole business was predicated on quick change. If they catch on to us with this, we'll change it to that, and they just tried to keep one step ahead.
So it wasn't all doom and gloom, though. There were places, I mean...
Yeah, there were some. Yeah.
Now, as an admirer of American ingenuity, may I share with you a piece of Canadian deviousness in note alteration that is just profound enough that I don't know if you thought of it. Back when a cigar was a smoke, and cigars came in wooden boxes of 50, 20, whatever, I was attracted to this hobby by looking at the cigar labels on those boxes. They were steel engraved intaglio. They were works of art. And what you would do if you were slightly crooked was to cut out the 100 from the 100 cigars and use that 100 to paste over what had been a $20 bill.
Yep.
In other words, the numerals off the cigar labels, steel engraved, black, beautiful, were actually used. If you go into a nostalgia store, you still
Yeah.
find those old boxes with the labels on it. But I have to admit that 60 years ago, that's what attracted me to steel engraving, and that led to saving up for my first dollar bill.
Yeah. And as Peter knows, do you recall who charter number 1000 is? Is it
Yeah, Bank of the Republic.
Bank of the Republic in New York? It was kind of the rich man's version of the racketeer nickel. They would, because on 1882 series brownbacks, the charter number was on the back of the note in prominent numerals, they would pass this off as a $1,000 bill, and with a few minor alterations to the face. So it didn't just, it pretty much wound down once we had a standardized design, but plenty of opportunities. Any other questions? We're going to be running out of time here, so we'll take one more and then.
Question I had was, when was the American public confident to use the paper money like they are today? It was good, was it? You said it.
Probably once they found out that they could spend national banknotes any place across the United States and not have to worry about it. I would say probably towards the end of the Civil War, because early in the Civil War, both the federal currency and the Confederate currency really fluctuated based on who was winning which battles on the battlefield as much as anything. The greenbacks were selling at a tremendous discount well into 1862, for example. And Confederate notes actually traded at a premium for the first year or so of the war. So probably by the end of the Civil War, they had finally decided that A, the war was pretty well settled, and B, that they could trust the backing. Okay, thank you very much.